Unsafe Havens, the Rise of Homelessness and Abuse During the Pandemic. My name is M. Joy, my pronouns are they and them, and I am the program coordinator for Women Helping Women. It is my pleasure to introduce some amazing folks in our community who are doing the hard frontline work of serving survivors and serving folks who are experiencing homelessness in our greater Cincinnati region. Just as a quick reminder, please keep your video off and yourself muted for the duration of the conversation. We will have time at the end for questions and answers, and at that time you are welcome to unmute yourself and take yourself and turn on your video in order to interact with our wonderful panelists. I'm going to go ahead and get started by introducing our panelists for this evening. I'm going to start with my colleague, Amy Blazer, who is the, I'm not sure of your title, Manager of Direct Services?
Director of Intervention Services.
Director of Intervention Services. So if you can, when you introduce yourself, please give your name, your pronouns, your title, the organization that you work for or with, and then we will go into some further questions.
So I'm Amy Blazer. I work for Women Helping Women, where I am the Director of Intervention Services for Hamilton County. My pronouns are she, her, excuse me. And our agency focuses on sexual assault, stalking, and domestic violence, specifically intimate partner violence. And we'll go into specifically what that means later on.
Forgot to unmute. Thank you, Amy. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Nancy Sullivan with Transformation CDC.
Thank you, Em. Yes, Nancy Sullivan. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the Director of Transformation CDC, which is a nanoscale organization working with immigrants primarily from Central America and US-born children of immigrants in a range of different ways. So it could be around intimate partner violence, it could be around education issues, could be around ICE and lawyers, and so sort of a little of everything.
Great, thank you, Nancy. All right, I'd love to pass this to Mona Jenkins with the Greater Cincinnati Homeless Coalition.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. My name is Mona Jenkins. I am the Director of Development for the Greater Cincinnati Homeless Coalition. My pronouns are she, her, hers. The Homeless Coalition is an advocacy and education agency. So we have probably over 60 organizations, nonprofits, faith-based organizations that serve folks who are experiencing homelessness that we work with. And with that, we try to advocate for policy changes, but also advocate with tenants who are on the verge of losing their housing or have lost their housing.
Great, thank you for joining us, Mona. And last but definitely not least, I'd like to introduce Bonita Campbell from Lighthouse Youth Services.
Good evening and welcome everybody. My name is Bonita Campbell. I am the Vice President of Homeless Youth Services with Lighthouse Youth and Family Services. And we serve children, youth, and families, providing residential services, behavioral health, services in juvenile justice, as well as homeless youth services, which we'll be talking about tonight.
Great, thank you, Bonita. So, you know, one of the things that we hope to do with this conversation tonight is to really ground everybody in the issues of homelessness and abuse that are occurring in our communities. We know that sometimes there is a lot of misinformation regarding these issues, terms and definitions that are unclear, because oftentimes our only interactions or experiences of these issues come through media, whether that's social media or the news, a news report or a news article, which don't always capture the full scope or the full multifacetedness of the issue. So I'd love to actually start our conversation tonight by just going through some really essential terms and definitions to ground everybody and get everybody on the same page in terms of these topics and issues. So I'd actually like to toss it to Mona first to give us some clarity around the issue of homelessness, what that looks like for folks in our community, why, what are the big issues with homelessness pre-COVID, maybe what are some statistics, the scope of the issue, and yeah, I think that's good. Mona?
Sure. So let's talk about first the definition of homelessness. So often people assume that when we talk about people experiencing homelessness, we always want to use first person language, right? Because we hope that this is a temporary situation for people, right? HUD defines homelessness as an individual or a family who lacks a fixed, regular, or adequate nighttime residence. So that means that their primary residence is either public or it's a private place that's not meant really for habitation. It's living in a public or private shelter that's meant for temporary living situations, or it's a place where its residents will be there for 90 days or less. So an emergency shelter or things of that sort. We also have what's called the McKinney-Vento definition, which extends that a little bit more, and that's used a lot of times within our school systems. So our school systems recognize that homelessness is not just sleeping on the streets, but you may also be staying with relatives and doubling up or couch surfing. In addition to the living in the shelters, the living in your car. So it expands that a little bit more. And why that's so relevant is based on funding and assistance that's available. So if someone's coming in and they're living with a relative, according to HUD, that HUD's saying, nope, you're not experiencing homelessness. But if you are a student in Cincinnati Public Schools, the school system is saying, yes, technically this person is experiencing homelessness, and therefore those services should be extended to this individual or this family.
Mona, can you quickly define what HUD stands for?
Sorry, housing, so often we use acronyms so readily. HUD is the Housing and Urban Development. So it's the federal leg of that deals with housing.
Awesome, thank you. Mona, can you quickly give us an idea of the state of homelessness and affordable housing in the greater Cincinnati area?
Sure. So prior to COVID, we were already in a housing crisis. So based on several studies that were done through LISC and the Community Builders Institute in 2017, we discovered that within Hamilton County, we are short 40,000 units of affordable housing. And when we say affordable, we mean that someone should not pay any more than 30% of their income for their rent and their utilities. So whether that's rent or their mortgage, really, right? So another thing is that we always assume that when we talk about affordable housing, it's simply for folks who are getting a voucher or some type of assistance. But we never think about really homeowners also get assistance, right? Because they have tax deductions for, from their mortgage taxes, there's a deduction. And so that's a type of subsidy. It's just a different kind of subsidy. So we were already short within Hamilton County. With new development that is happening in various neighborhoods, we started seeing more folks getting displaced. So in communities like Walnut Hills, Over the Rhine had it in the past 10 years, where 2,300 units of affordable housing was lost. North Side is changing over. And one of the most recent changeovers that we're going to start seeing is within the West End because of the FC soccer stadium that is being built. So we saw families being displaced from there as well. When COVID hit, it got worse. So, and especially with the need to spread out and socially distance, we saw hospitals releasing folks without places to go. We saw our jail systems releasing folks without places to go. Our shelters had to, that were already over capacity because of the housing crisis. For their safety, we had to spread those folks out. And so some folks ended up moving into hotels. We were a lucky enough city to where we were more proactive in how we addressed it. So where some cities were experiencing huge outbreaks in the shelters, we had less than a handful of cases happen within our shelters.
Great. Thank you for giving us some insight into that issue and current situation. I'd like to pass it to Bonita to kind of further the conversation or discussion around homelessness, specifically as it relates to youth homelessness, how that is defined, what that looks like in our community, what are the pathways to youth homelessness, and any statistics or further scope of the issue that you'd like to provide as well.
Thank you. So related to the definition that Mona has spoke about in terms of HUD definitions are the same. There is one additional definition that has to do with young people being at risk of homelessness or imminent homelessness, which is really defined as couch surfing. And so there are often young people who are moving about from house to house, sometimes relatives, often friends, believe it or not, sometimes even teachers, that allow a young person to sleep on their couch for days at a time, sometimes even weeks at a time. And that is also considered a form of homelessness. And we sort of call that couch surfing, but it causes instability in a young person's life. We did talk a little bit about, Mona spoke about McKinney-Vento and what happens in school systems and how those young people get identified in schools as well. Young people that are homeless will often go to school to specifically find a place to sleep. And when you conceptualize that, that young person's not learning. They are spending their day at school, literally trying to figure out where is the next place that I'm going to place my head at night. And there's a significant amount of brain power that is spent really just doing that. And so they're not learning what they should learn in school every day. And that cycle starts over every single day. Where are they going to sleep? The other reason that they're going to school is to simply eat. And so what we know is that having housing stability is sort of the precursor for everything else that then they can build upon for a strong foundation of their life and to begin to then focus on their education and focus on what's next in their future. So that's critical. And one of the things that is also critical in our community and for people to understand is that those people are often hidden. The other thing that's key is the LGBTQ population and where homelessness hits that population really, really hard. It is because, well, we know that 40% of young people that are homeless are LGBTQ. And when we define youth homelessness, we're talking about children through the age of 24. And I think in general, people don't realize that youth is really defined up to the age of 24. Now that's also HUD definitions and different funders and how they define youth. But in general, we're talking about up to age 24. And so when you consider that 40% of young homeless people are LGBTQ, that's a huge chunk of those young individuals that are homeless. And they're often hidden because we are on the streets trying to find those young individuals because of the degradation that they've experienced, because of being really vulnerable. They're not often in the shelters. They are truly couch surfing, and they're going from place to place trying to figure out where they can be safe because they don't necessarily trust the shelter systems, and they haven't been welcomed into shelter systems. And so that's critical that we really consider that population and make sure their services are welcoming and affirming for them.
Awesome. Thank you, Bonita. Can you give us a sense of approximately how many youth in the greater Cincinnati area are on average experiencing homelessness at any given time?
At any given time, there are probably about 100 to 200 young homeless adults on the streets of Cincinnati. In a year's time, we see 800 homeless young children and adults in the Cincinnati area. And those are the ones that we know. Those are the ones that we're able to count through our homeless management information system, which is the HMIS system.
Yeah, I think, part of the issue, not just with abuse, but also homelessness, is that we only have the numbers on the folks who start to engage with the system and not necessarily those folks who experience temporary homelessness, that couch surfing in particular. A lot of stories go untold, and people don't necessarily engage with the system and seek community support through these issues.
And the other thing, I'm sorry, the other thing with COVID is the places where we normally find these young people, particularly the LGBTQ population, are closed. So the library is a place where we often can find them, and the libraries has been a huge partner to us to be able to find young people, but they're only open a couple of hours a day because of COVID, understandably, and social distancing and keeping the community safe. The couches that this population generally could be on are not welcoming because they're trying to keep their own family safe. And so again, it's a hidden population, and we really have to find them. Lighthouse operates a street outreach team that is literally on the streets trying to find these young adults, bring them into the system, either through the Shakely Center for Youth or Meekum House. But again, we have to find them, and where are they, and are they safe?
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Bonita. I'm going to pass it now to Amy to talk to us about the issues of domestic violence and intimate partner violence in our community.
So domestic violence itself, if you go by what the actual definition is, it's a excuse me, it's a pattern of behavior in which one person that you are either related to, in a relationship with, or reside with. So sometimes it lumps in like roommates or people that you share a dwelling with. And one person uses something along the lines of physical control, sexual control, financial control, and or emotional control or abuse, with the ultimate goal of kind of maintaining power over someone, exerting control and power over them. The way our agency operates, it's kind of the way Bonita and Mona were discussing. There's two different definitions that exist in our world. There's the legal definition, which when you start talking about entering into systems, so legal systems, housing systems, other social service needs, you sometimes have to meet a legal definition. So the legal definition is what is written in Ohio's revised code to meet the threshold for a domestic violence charge. So that's when someone knowingly causes or attempts to cause physical harm to a family or household member, excuse me. And then there's a couple of other criteria that you have to meet. So as soon as you hear that, you automatically hear that a lot of the things that exist under a definition of domestic violence aren't actually captured in a legal definition of domestic violence. So there's a big gap, if you will, where we kind of try to fill in for all of the additional, what we call our umbrella definition or our social umbrella definition, where if someone is reaching out because they've been experiencing financial abuse, or maybe verbal abuse that don't necessarily involve direct threats, but involve making statements that make you feel threatened. Kind of those hidden areas where people feel and know they're being controlled and abused, but systems don't acknowledge that. And our agency specifically focuses on what's called intimate partner violence. So domestic violence encompasses any familial relationship or household relationship. And we specifically focus on those people that have either been living together in an intimate partnership, dating, married, formerly married, some type of intimate relationship, shared children, you kind of name it. And mainly the reason we try to focus in on that, I'm sorry, at least from my perspective, is when you start widening that umbrella to capture everything, we ourselves, I don't think, are capable of doing all of that. So we're fortunate that there's other agencies in this area, and that we are in an area where there are multiple agencies that address a lot of the different peaks of it.
Amy, can you give us really quickly just basically the scope of these issues within our area? Women Helping Women serves more than just Hamilton County. We serve Brown and Adams counties and Butler County as well. But if you could give us just a quick idea of how many clients we serve a year, or an idea of how many people experience these forms of violence, that would be great.
Yeah. So nationally, usually about 1 in 4 women experience this type of violence, and 1 in 10 men. With COVID, specifically in Cincinnati, there's been a 38% increase to that. So we're seeing, now we're looking at excuse me, roughly 35 to 40% of people experiencing violence in their home versus previous to COVID, it was around 25%, which is a huge increase, especially, just as Mona and Bonita had said, systems had already been stressed prior to COVID. Because for us, housing is a big issue as well, because if some part of safety planning is to make sure someone is physically safe and able to be in a place where they can think through about what are my next steps, how can I figure out how to do this, and how to be safe from my abuser. And when you don't have a safe place to put somebody or to help them access it, it kind of hinders your ability to safety plan with them, because your safety plan turns into, how do I stay safe tonight in this same place? So that's kind of what the impact has been. Annually, our agency itself serves about 11,000 people across all 4 counties. Specifically in Hamilton County, we probably serve between like 4,500 and 5,000. And it ranges from, sometimes people have 1 contact with us to people who have had contact with us for the last 10 years. So it really just kind of crosses all sorts of walks of life and people and need and different types of everything that you can think of.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I also want to say too, as the prevention coordinator for Women Helping Women, our role doing prevention work is to stop these things from happening in the first place. And the main way that we do that is by going into the schools, middle schools and high schools, and doing a program on dating and sexual violence prevention and healthy relationships, skill building. One of the things that we also know is that approximately 60 million children experience domestic violence or live in violent or abusive households. And so when we see, or when we hear about those young folks experiencing violence, which then sets them up for uncertain futures in terms of having healthy relationships or not, We definitely, as an agency, we try to work with youth to build those skills and build those forms of recognition of violence. We do try to address some safety issues in the home. As an agency, we don't really see clients younger than the age of 13, but we have definitely referred teen clients to the agency, to direct service, for some forms of assistance and referrals to other agencies like Lighthouse. So I just want to throw that out there, that this is, you know, these issues are definitely things that affect the young people in our community in overwhelming amounts as well. I would love to pass it off lastly to Nancy. Nancy, if you could also give us an idea, you know, you work specifically with the immigrant and refugee community here in Cincinnati. If you can give us an idea of the services that your agency provides, and how these issues of homelessness and abuse also intersect with your clients.
Thank you. Yes, it's a very different group. Um, and I don't work with too many people who would be legally considered refugees. Most of the people I work with are immigrants, and within those immigrants, the majority are perhaps asylum seekers, but they are undocumented. So they have a lot of barriers that most of the people listening to this or watching this don't have, in terms of language, their legal status, they're under where to go, and they're also have a very different value set, which is typically called familismo, which is a really strong feeling about the family, that the family as a unit is more important than I am as an individual. And so people are much more reluctant to leave an abuser, you know, for all the same reasons that plenty of other people have, but also what it will do to the family. And I went back and looked at some of the, police statistics for the past couple of years on DV in the Hispanic community. And if you've ever looked at the, like the police records, it will say whether or not the victim of domestic violence is somebody of Hispanic origin. So I pulled up like 19 cases in 2019. In 2020, there have been 45, and 20 of those in the last 3 months. So that says something. A survey in Virginia said that 37% of the women, Hispanic women there, who said they'd experienced domestic violence, also experienced relocation or homelessness. What we see much more than, for instance, Mona indicated for the rest of the population, is people already doubling up. That's one reason that the COVID rate is higher in the Hispanic community, is when you've got two families living in a 2-bedroom apartment, you know, suddenly you might have a third family living in the living room. And just as an example of that, Thursday night, we got a call from a woman in Geneva, New York, a Guatemalan woman. I'm like, why would you even be in Geneva? It's in the middle of nowhere. But she had experienced violence. She had some very distant relatives here in Cincinnati, and she wanted to figure out how she and her 3 little girls, including an 8-month-old baby, could get here. So the community kind of pulled together, got her here, and she moved in with these distant relatives for a couple of days. You know, there's like 10 kids all together. And then she texted me this morning and said, oh, I found a room for the 4 of us to go in Fairfield. not an apartment, but a room to rent. And that's very, very common. So that what we think of as homelessness is not it's not experienced in the same way. I'm curious about what statistics may be in the rest of the American population around percentages of people who may experience intimate partner violence who actually call police or call for services. Approximately 1 in 3 Hispanic women will have experienced sexual or physical violence in the home in her life. Only 50% at the most call. And with the immigrants, it's so standard in a very patriarchal society that they're going to be beaten, especially if the man gets drunk. I mean, the number of people who've told me, yes, as a little girl, I had to run out onto the mountain in the middle of the night because he was, beating everybody. Well, what about the police? Well, first of all, there aren't any police where we lived. And second of all, a few people where there were police, the men, they would just laugh, or the men would pay off the police. So there isn't any kind of expectation that there will be help. One of the things that we see is that, the older women who've arrived here as young adults, I don't want to say they're fatalistic, but they're totally in this familismo attitude. Their children born here have a whole different level of acculturation. So I know a number of times when it's been like the teenage daughter who's called on the man. But I know of all the cases I happen to know, in only one of those did the victim go to court to testify. And the reason for that is sometimes it's just pure family pressure. His family will insist, just be all over her, like you wouldn't believe, not to do it. But there's also the fear that if he is convicted, he will be deported. It's moral turpitude. So she is, her family now has half the income. And the man may also say, if you call the police on me, they're going to arrest you too because you're illegal. And she doesn't understand that, in fact, there's a specific type of a visa, a U visa, for victims of crimes who assist the police. So there's just a lot of gaps in knowledge, as well as this huge different cultural gap.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that information with us, Nancy. So now that we have kind of a general scope of these issues, we've clarified some terms and definitions. And as always, folks who are watching, if you have any questions about terminology or language that is used, feel free to put that in the chat box, and we can, we have folks behind the scenes who can answer those for you during the presentation. We'll also, once again, have questions for the panelists at the end. But I want to now turn to our questions for the panelists. So a few of you have spoken already to the pandemic and how the pandemic has, not only increased the rates of homelessness and abuse that we're seeing, but also how it's posed a lot of challenges to people seeking services and seeking help, not just from service agencies, but also from community members and family members. So I'd love to open up with this question of, first and foremost, how, what are some specific ways that the pandemic has affected the clients that are either experiencing homelessness or domestic violence? Or how has COVID created barriers. And let me go ahead and start with Bonita.
Sorry, took me a minute to unmute. Uh, with our young population of 18 to 24-year-olds, they're back in the situation where most of their employment was the restaurants and part-time employment. So of course they were the first hit and the hardest hit. So it has become very difficult for them to sustain their housing. So obviously they're ending up in homelessness because they can't afford their housing. Or are facing, if they get housing, how are they going to sustain it? There, once again, if you recall back when we were in the recession period, where they were competing against people who had more marketable skills, higher education, higher level paying jobs, they're competing against those people again for those higher paying jobs. And that's just making it very difficult, and also sort of doubting their own capabilities and competence. And so when you're fighting against, I'm young and I'm homeless, and also what's out there for me, and I'm competing against these people, and I feel like I just don't cut the mustard, if you will, it just is that much more of a barrier for them. So that's really difficult. Coupled with just housing is difficult to find. Housing's harder as well because during the pandemic, we were not getting even the turnover of apartments the way that we did. Construction stopped. So if there were no people to fix the apartments, to move, to get, if an apartment was available, we couldn't get inspections on the apartments. It just clogged up the entire system for young people, for everybody, but also the young people just finding those affordable neighborhoods and safe neighborhoods. Everybody wants a safe neighborhood, but when you're young and you're just starting out, I think it's even more so where you're thinking, well, this is my first apartment. I really want to have a place that I feel that I'm secure and I'm safe, and don't want to be in a situation where I'm vulnerable. So it's really, really hard for them to think about, how am I going to have a future in this, and what will this be? There is this really interesting thing, and I think Mona mentioned it, that we haven't seen, thankfully, being blessed, a lot of COVID amongst the homeless population in our city. We have truly been blessed as a city when we look at our homeless population. So there's almost an invincibility, if you will, among our young people in particular. But I also know that at Lighthouse, we have done a lot in terms of our what we call our COVID protocols to try to limit some of the comings and goings of the young people to keep them safe. And they've done really well with that. And I think that they've learned some lessons from that as well. So we've done a good job, I think, as a community.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Bonita. Mona, can you chime in and share how the pandemic has created barriers or affected your clients?
Sure. So as Benita mentioned, it's, again, pre-COVID, there was already a shortage. And so COVID has increased that shortage, where we're seeing folks have lost their jobs and as a result aren't able to pay their rents and are getting evicted. So therefore, there's more folks who are experiencing homelessness. Then they don't have the funds to turn around and get another apartment or a place to live. So that makes it more difficult. And the fact that there's just not the housing stock available. And when we see development projects happening, and these projects intentionally are excluding families, they're intentionally targeting a different market. When you have studio apartments that are at $1,000 a month, that's not affordable. I know to me, but according to statistics within Hamilton County, not according to a lot of folks, right? When we look at the poverty rate within the city of Cincinnati, we have one of the highest in the country. I wish that the Bengals and the Reds performed as well as our poverty rates in the city. It's absolutely, we should not be rated so high within something like that. 72% of our children within the schools are experiencing homelessness. We noticed that, you know, at one point we were saying was about 20% of children within Cincinnati public schools were experiencing homelessness. It's now closer to 25%. So when you look at classrooms that have about 25 children, at least 5 of those are experiencing homelessness. So yeah, a lot with the development, and as I mentioned, with, you know, hospitals releasing folks and our jail systems releasing folks, we often recognize folks who are walking around the downtown area near our office, right? We know some folks who are experiencing homelessness and are working with our agencies to get housing. And right when COVID started, we happened to notice that there were some new folks walking around. So we saw an increase in people who just, like folks said earlier, their relatives want to protect themselves. So all of a sudden, someone's mom is like, hey, you got to go because I'm a high risk. So folks were getting kicked out of those couch surfing situations. They were getting kicked out of those doubling up situations. We also see an increase among our agencies. So Our Daily Bread is one of our agencies, and where they were averaging about 150 meals a day, it went up to 300 meals a day. It went up to 700 meals a day. So we're seeing that it's not only the housing, but it's the basic needs of food. Again, going back to losing a job that probably was not even paying livable wages at that point. So it's, you know, it's that social safety net that already was tight, and all of a sudden somebody just cut those strings, and folks are really falling apart. And we're seeing a necessity to really take charge and lead some conversations like this one, as far as what we can do, some policy changes that need to happen, and some real commitment and intentional actions directed towards addressing housing.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Mona. Amy, I'd love for you to join us as well. You already spoke to a little bit how COVID has impacted our clients, but if you could actually really speak to those barriers that have been put in place, not just for survivors or victims who are the barriers to leaving abusive folks in their homes, but maybe barriers to receiving services as well.
Yeah, can you hear me? Because I'm kind of doing this on my phone and on my laptop. Okay. So the barriers when it comes to leaving, I mean, we could sit here and list off a ton of them all day long. And they're kind of, and a lot of people are very familiar with the ideas, because they're usually the ones that come up a lot, where, you know, the quintessential question of, well, why didn't they just leave? Well, on the back end, there's everything from children to health insurance to marriage to religion to threats. You know, people who are experiencing abuse, it's not this scene in a movie, right? It's not something that's going to quickly pass in a couple of seconds, or move to a different frame and we're in a different reality. For them, that is what they are living in every day, every minute. So just that alone is a huge barrier for people. So then when you bring in the pandemic, that kind of changed a lot of things, because we used to be able to intercept people through different systems. So, you know, hospitals would call us, whether the survivor wanted us to come in person to meet with them, safety plan, you know, help figure out a strategy, or even on the phone. Well, now we've recently been removed from a lot of hospitals again. So, you instantly lose that connection, because unfortunately there's just barriers that have existed prior to COVID. Is, cell phones get broken, phone numbers change constantly. Abusers monitor a lot of phone usage, phone calls, text messages. So it showing up in places like that, it was a safe place to have a conversation that wouldn't throw up any red flags. The same thing with even court systems. I can't tell you how many times we used to get phone calls in a day from someone who is sitting at the clerk's desk and just recognize somebody who needed our services. And because of COVID, it instantly has put up this barrier almost of people who are in those positions still, of being very distant, and not engaging as much because they're worried about, keeping social distance, not engaging with people for too long because they don't want to catch something. But even more so when it comes to COVID itself, we've seen everything from abusers threatening to expose survivors to COVID, especially if they consider themselves to be high risk, or have some pre-existing conditions that would probably make COVID harsher for them. There's excuse me. There's been a big change in lethality. We used to see not a gradual increase, but an increase where if you're talking to somebody in safety planning and you heard certain things happening, you could kind of give a forecast of if you hear these things, or if you start experiencing this type of abuse. So typically when you escalate to strangulation, that should be a red flag. And we would prep clients for that, because you have to be honest and tell them what might be coming and what to be alert to. And we are now consistently getting people when it's already escalated. It hasn't had a chance to even let us intervene at an earlier time period. So all of a sudden, people who are calling, they're already at the lethal level. They've experienced strangulation multiple times within a day. We recently had interactions with people where I think the most was 4 times in one day, and that person managed to make it to the hospital. But still, that type of behavior is so lethal, and it's becoming more common. It used to be not so common for that to be the first time we have a conversation with you. And so when you start talking about those lethal levels, you have to really look at safety planning in terms of it's not safe for you to physically be there anymore. And what COVID has done is unfortunately kind of hit from every side, if you will. It's caused shelters to be at their full census on a pretty frequent basis. Today alone, I think we called 10 different shelters for somebody, and we were 0 for 10. There's a lot of funding cuts have happened because of COVID and the political effects and things that have happened. So even, we ourselves, and I'm sure plenty of other agencies that are in this and listening, have experienced funding cuts. So the ability for us to emergency placement in hotels, that's a really restricted thing now that used to not be a restriction. To permanent housing, just as Mona and Bonita have talked about throughout this, and I think Nancy touched on it as well. Even if we have the ability to get somebody connected fund-wise, so help with first month's rent and deposit, or help with finding a landlord who will accept a background that isn't clean. Even if we meet all of those things, the amount of rent, we are setting somebody up for just constant homelessness, to just be back in that vicious cycle. And that's really one of the things I think that has been a true barrier, is you have to sit back and when you're safety planning and thinking about abuse, you can't always do what we think is the best thing, because that person is eventually going to be put in a position, especially when it comes to homelessness, where they're going to make a decision of, should I sleep somewhere in a car or at a park or in a shelter, or should I go back to my abuser? And we are unfortunately seeing that becoming the bigger choice at this point, because there's so
there's been so many things removed from the system, or the system is just so out of capacity that it can't really make room for anybody at this point.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. You know, one of the things that I think you spoke to, Amy, was the because of COVID, that inaccessibility to even access those access points that we have to victims and survivors. And so for my role as a prevention educator, because a lot of the schools are virtual, we typically, when we go into a school, we usually have at least one or two student disclosures of abuse or assault. And we know that schools are probably the number one place where students feel safe when they are being abused at home, or if they have been assaulted by a family member. And usually we're, as preventionists, are on the front line of fielding those disclosures and getting those young folks the resources and support that they need. And so that's definitely been a barrier for us in serving those young folks as well. Really quickly, I want to turn it over to Nancy to quickly share with us some barriers and things that you have seen with the immigrant population because of COVID.
Well, there's several barriers. Obviously, many people are struggling financially. It's a big issue in Congress. Is anything going to happen there right now? Several sources of funding were available in the spring. And some of us really fought like tigers to say, wait a minute, immigrants have been contributing to the economy. You're not going to get anything from Amazon without them, because they're doing all the packing. So they need to be considered essential parts of the economy. If they can't work, they need particularly rent support. And I had a really hard time with that. I think finally, just to shut me up, I got about $13,000, and I was able to help, something like 30 families. However, then an SEIU union organizer called me from Chicago about one of their members who tested positive. He lives right around the corner from me, tested positive, wasn't particularly sick, but that meant that the 5 adults and the 5 children in the household couldn't leave, right?
Nancy, really sorry to interrupt you. What does SEIU stand for?
Service Employees International Union. Thanks. So it's obviously service workers. It's people cleaning hospitals. It's janitors. So this guy called me from Chicago. Can you please do something to help these people? So I was able to get them a rent check and food and diapers for the children. But when the money became available through the feds to the county, it was almost completely impossible for immigrants to access that money, which was crazy because it was millions of dollars. And yet, if you couldn't show a social security number, and that was on the federal side, that wasn't the county's fault. So then you go to other family members for loans so that you don't get kicked out. So the other thing I would say, and this is not intended as a dig at any of the shelters, but it's the whole question of cultural competency. So I know a few women who've gone to the big Y shelter, and they've left almost immediately because none of the food was familiar. Of course, they weren't allowed in the kitchen to cook. It was just so overwhelming. There was nobody who could speak to them in Spanish, and I think that's changed. But it was so alien that they were going to go back to what they knew. And so those are some really specific barriers.
Nancy, can you speak to, you know, immigration is a really big issue, multifaceted, many layers to it, especially in our country and with the current administration and also former administrations as well. Um, can you speak to, the threat of deportation or even just detainment? There is, I believe there is an ICE facility in Blue Ash, if I'm correct. Can you kind of speak to um, the dangers of that holding facility and the kind of barriers that our immigrant communities face in terms of immigration control and deportation and detention?
Okay, so yeah, that's a lot. That's a whole nother 2-hour webinar.
Right.
Well, many of the women
Summary.
are here with their children because they were in fact fleeing domestic violence. And if they have older children, those children have made their way here. You know, I remember seeing, just as an example, a mother who was able to read. And I have to say that that's another barrier to accessing services. Some organizations are really good now about putting bilingual information up about where to get help, etc. But if you don't read in any language because you're indigenous and your government didn't give a damn about you getting an education, then you can't read. You can't figure out how to get those services. So in terms of it keeps changing around here. Last a year and a half ago, there were some really big raids in northern Ohio. We haven't seen that here, but so the facility in Blue Ash is technically it's Homeland Security. Part of it is ICE. Part of it is presumably looking for people who are being trafficked. So they're actually doing good work. But the ICE, so there are 2 or 3 holding cells there. People don't stay there very long. They go there, they get transferred to Butler County. Butler County Jail, which is in downtown Hamilton, has a 200-bed wing that's just for immigrants essentially awaiting deportation. And that it's a moneymaker. That's why they have it. So the only good thing is, if I have to take somebody to ICE to check in or I'm concerned, I will always make sure they take their children, because there's technically no family detention in this region. So there would be nowhere to house a mother and children. On the other hand, a while back, ICE was hanging out in the parking lot of a 380 unit, Mona will know, LIHTC housing community in Springdale. LIHTC is low income housing tax credits. So the owner charges, it's not Section 8. The owner has to charge less than he might otherwise in return for a huge tax credit. So about 80% of the people, sorry, I don't have COVID. About 80% of the people in this big housing complex are immigrants. And ICE was just hanging out there early in the morning, waiting for people to come home from work or go to work. And one day they picked up a father, and without intentionally doing it, the next day they picked up the mother, leaving 4 children behind, and both of those adults were deported. So, and then you've got this situation literally a child cannot get on, or nobody can get on an international flight without a passport. So I've known immigrants who were locked up in Butler County to be taken to Chicago to the Guatemalan consulate in order to get their passport in order to be deported, as absurd as that is. And that's always hanging over people. The fear of when I come home from school, my mom won't be there. And when you think about just what that does to your system to be constantly stressed, and now it's jobs, now it's I'm locked in essentially with someone who's been aggressive in the past. The men all too often drink very heavily, and that's when they get abusive. There are few Spanish language AAs, but they all start at 8:30 at night. So if you work a night shift, even if you were interested, you're not going to be able to get there.
Gotcha. Thank you for sharing that with us, Nancy. I want to move us forward in our questions. We talked about, how the pandemic has really made things worse in a lot of ways. But I want us to actually talk about for a moment, what are the positives that have come out of this? What are the ways that your agencies, how have you responded to this different need or this increased need in creative ways? Mona and Bonita, you both talked about how the homeless population, those folks who are living in shelters, we've seen relatively low cases or incidents of COVID here in Greater Cincinnati. So that speaks to a lot of brilliant work and great work that you all are doing to prevent the spread and keep people safe. I know for Women Helping Women, we've shifted and changed the way that we work in some ways. So I'd really love to hear from our panelists as to those innovations or those creative ways that we've been responding and trying to meet the needs of folks in our communities. So I'm going to start with Amy to talk about the ways that Women Helping Women have pivoted.
Yeah. Sorry. So probably probably the most creative way that's existed for us is in part due to technology. As much as we all probably dislike not being able to be face to face with people anymore and being in large groups, it's really allowed us to get creative with technology. So our support groups are online now, which at first we thought would be a barrier. But the wonderful part of it is that we've removed a lot of barriers. So in the past, you would have to come downtown, figure out parking, childcare. Even if we provided childcare, it wasn't always a feasible option. And now survivors get to join from home. They can call in. They don't even need, access to technology necessarily. And their kids can be there. It's really opened up that access. So we've seen our support groups really increase. With that, we were able to, for the first time ever, have a successfully operating Spanish-speaking support group, which we had tried so many times, but we just could never get it to catch. And now we consistently have one every week because we've removed those barriers where if you are just leaving work, you just call in or you do it however you want. One of the other ways is because of COVID with the legal system, they've kind of laxed their rules in terms of appearances. So people aren't being penalized if they either test positive for COVID or if there's an issue with appearance. They're allowing Zoom appearances for protection orders. Same thing with criminal hearings. There's a lot more, from our experience, there's a lot more communication going on than what used to happen. Because things are changing so frequently that there has to be a push for communication from court systems. So we found that turns into more prosecutors engaging with survivors earlier than the day of court, or leaving a message for someone about your case and hearing back from them, because that person's working from home and they are able to actually return phone calls. And probably I would also say just the advocacy itself has always been probably one of those things that just constantly changes and meets the needs of people. And I think one of the great things is that COVID has done has highlighted that even with social distancing and having to wear a mask and checking temperatures and things like that, I think we've also been able to communicate to survivors that their safety is the utmost importance to us. So we still do show up to court. We help advocate if they are experiencing symptoms. The things that you would never think about advocacy, they're kind of becoming part of our safety planning and the daily work that we do. And I mean, it's also for a lot of survivors, it's also opened up this idea of being more willing to express what's going on, because as I was talking previously about how lethality has increased, we're seeing that that's pushing people to be more willing to participate in systems and to participate in protection order hearings and to tell people what's truly going on, because it's at a higher risk level. So I really think that survivors have kind of taken it by the reins, in all honesty, and really have been pushing back against the idea of, well, I'm not going to just be shut in with an abuser. I think there's a huge fear that people are just sitting at home with abusers, and they are. But I think the people who are reaching out also understand more intently that they're reaching out for a specific purpose. And I think they believe in who they're reaching out to at that point.
Yeah, I also just want to add, one of the shifts, things that we've kind of been working on as an agency, even prior to COVID, was turning our 24-hour hotline into a text hotline as well. So that actually has been a really great way to reach folks who maybe couldn't make a phone call because their abuser was present in the room or was nearby to overhear them. The text function has also been really great for our kids. I don't know, Amy, if you all have seen any increases in like teen clients because of the text capabilities, but I know that when I mention in the classroom that we have that capability, like that, the youth really respond to that.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up, Em, and I completely forget about the text and chat thing because we did it at the very beginning of all of this. So it's one of those things that's been around long enough to where it feels like it's just part of what we do.
20 years ago.
Yeah.
When the year started. Yeah.
Yeah, when we flipped the phone line on, that came on too. We have seen a huge number of teens reaching out via text because, one, you can be anonymous. There's no way to trace who you are unless you tell us who you are. And so they're having more frank discussions with us. The number of teens that have reached out talking about people who are either abusing them or they feel unsafe or they're reaching out on behalf of a friend. We've seen a lot of that happening where, a friend confided in me about this and I don't know what to do. And I can honestly say that, I mean, I've been answering our hotline for 5 years now, and I maybe had 1 or 2 phone calls like that a year. And all of a sudden in our text and chat hotline, it's probably every day that somebody is doing that. So it's nice to know that we're also reaching more people who would never have access to information you know, and don't have that fear of, well, they're at least going to know who I am, or I'm going to have to tell them, you know, something and I'm going to get in trouble. So it's been nice to have those conversations and give that information out and not take away somebody's safety.
Awesome. Amy, one last question. The Domestic Violence Emergency Response Team, also known as DVERT program at Women Helping Women, that was something that was launched pre-COVID. But I'm wondering how that program has shifted or changed at all with the pandemic. And if you can speak to what that program does for those folks who aren't familiar.
Yeah. DIVERT, they are, it's Domestic Violence Enhanced Response Team. And what they what they do is we partner with law enforcement agencies. The first one we partnered with was the Cincinnati Police Department, but we now partner with six law enforcement agencies. And what we do is when someone calls 911 and there is any type of intimate partner violence that's involved, anything from actual domestic violence to threats to we see a lot of criminal damaging, so like breaking windows, breaking cell phones, stuff like that. If there's any type of intimate partner relationship that exists, once the scene is considered safe, those officers will call our advocates and ask for them to come on scene. So we go meet people face to face and just introduce ourselves, safety plan with them for that night, and then we arrange for follow-up the next day. Before COVID, it was a very seamless process. There was a small interruption because I'm sure like everybody else, when they originally issued the stay-at-home orders, none of us had access to PPE and, you know, everybody's scrambling for hand sanitizer. So we put DIVERT on hold for about 30 days. Then after that, we, with the help of law enforcement, they helped train us on different things, such as how we meet with people outside if it's at all possible. We hand out different PPE to survivors if they don't have any. So it kind of morphed into this thing where we're still doing our advocacy work, but we're also trying to ensure that just genuine safety of people is taking place. But honestly, the biggest change is going to be coming here soon. We recently received a technology grant for DIVERT, and they'll be able to, while on scene, they'll be able to give an iPad to either the law enforcement officer or the survivor, so that all three people don't have to be standing together, but everybody is still communicating and still being involved together on scene with each other. The other biggest change has been the safety planning itself. Everything from trying to figure out how to get people into hotels. We have put a lot more people on a Greyhound than I ever thought we would. And then we also have probably given out more gift cards for food and diapers and formula, things like that, than I ever thought that we would probably need to do. Because more and more, we're just seeing more people who don't have anything. So sometimes that's part of just just because you show up and you're the person who showed up.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'd like to turn it over to Mona. Mona, can you speak to the creative or innovative ways that the Homeless Coalition and your partner agencies have been helping folks?
Sure. So with the need for some of our shelters to socially distance, we were able to partner with several hotels and build relationships with those folks to allow us to use their rooms to accommodate folks who are experiencing homelessness. So we were able to get folks into hotels during COVID, and now with the winter shelter opening, those same hotels have been able to assist us as well. which is great, because we're seeing a decrease in the availability of beds, not only here in Cincinnati, but in Northern Kentucky as well. So unfortunately, they've had to close, and they'll be seeing a loss of about 100 beds due to COVID restrictions and not being able to accommodate. So we were able to make some arrangements and accommodations possible through our relationships with the hotels. This had us looking and examining like the shelter facilities itself and the need for using soap dispensers where you don't have to press it, right? So handless, footless, opening doors with foot pedals and things like that. So we started looking more into that and how can we stop not only just the spread of COVID, but just, preventing the spread of the flu or other communicable diseases. Examining how to create mutual aid is another thing, right? So again, these families are experiencing shortages in food. So we were able to not only provide folks who are experiencing homelessness some additional resources, but also community members who wanted to have a better understanding of the system and how did we get here and what do we need to do to address the issue. So our education programs have all gone online. So folks can, from the comfort of their home, sign up with Dr. Mark Mussman for different sessions that talk about policies, that talk about the current situation, what are some of the needs of people. So we're able to get a lot more of the work that we're doing and to communicate more with folks in how to get involved. One of the other things we are able to do, one of the direct services that the Homeless Coalition provides is mailboxes. So it's always been a barrier that if someone is sleeping on the streets or doesn't have a stable address, but yet they've signed up for services from Job and Family Services. They may have legal documentations that they need to get. They may have medications that they're on that they get mailed. We provide mail service. And so we realize that right now, some folks don't want to ride the bus to come downtown. Some folks may not have the funding or the transportation or other barriers. And so we're in the process of upgrading our mail system to where someone can check online or through an app or their phone to see if they have mail instead of having to come all the way down. Nope, it's not there. Their food stamp card isn't there. Their check isn't there. And then they got to, come back the next day as well. So we're able to both serve the folks who are experiencing homelessness, but also our agencies and the community in general a little bit better in examining some of the processes that we already had and then how to make adjustments for not only COVID, but going forward as well.
That's awesome, Mona. I'm so excited for that system for you all and for your clients. Bonita, can you share with us some innovations or ways that you all have responded?
Yes, thank you. So I think, as everyone has said, technology has been huge in being able to serve young people. But for us in particular, one thing that COVID has done is keep our young people still. So with this population, they move around a lot. And our staff has been able to find them. So that has been incredible. In addition to our 2 shelters, we have about 400 young people in the community that we serve either through case management and or housing. So the case managers are able to find them in their homes. So that's incredible. As well as even if when we're doing telehealth, so able to connect with them through the web and Zoom, we use Zoom as our platform as well. some young people, believe it or not, were happy to have case managers come and visit them because they were sheltered in for some period of time, and some were really complying with that, afraid of COVID. So to have someone come in their apartment and meet with them was great, to be able to provide resources and just some company because they were lonely. Um, we were also able to, through funding resources and everything else, help some young people with um, internet services and phones and things like that, to be able to make sure that they could meet their obligations as well and stay connected with us. We also operate a permanent supportive housing program. And so those young people had critical mental health needs that needed to continue to be met in order for them to stay stable. So it was critical that they could meet through telehealth with their mental health providers, whether that was Lighthouse or other providers within the community. And so we really focused to make sure that they continued to remain stable. So that was critical as well. The other thing that we have continued to do is just partnering with all of our resources within the community. Again, employment resources has been critical everywhere that we can to make sure that we could get those young people jobs wherever we could. And we created some new partnerships for that. But I think for the most part, for our young people, is just making sure that they have somebody they can reach out to at all times. So our case managers just were making sure that they had the capabilities through phones for transportation resources. Of course, the bus passes and everything was critical to make sure that they could get to the case managers when they needed help. We had a number of volunteer resources to make sure that young people had food, because that was critical. When they didn't have jobs, they didn't have any food. So we had to make sure that they could even eat. Many of them didn't qualify for food assistance. And so we had to make sure that they were able to get those resources as well. And we had a lot of our volunteers and board members that were even contributing to that. So it's just they're really resilient. They've done a lot to ensure that they could still make it, and they've just been incredible.
That's so awesome. Um, I would like to finish off this question with Nancy. Nancy, are there any creative or innovative ways, or even just regular old ways, that you all have changed your services or adapted to meet the needs of your clients during this pandemic? And after you answer this question, we will move on to our last question for the panelists, and then participant questions.
Great. So we looked around at some of the things that were happening probably as a result of the pandemic. And one of those was the schools closing in the spring. And what specifically happened here in Price Hill was that a very loose, not a gang with a name, but a sort of a revolving door of like 12-year-old kids were assaulting and robbing immigrants, knowing that they're often not banked and may carry a lot of cash on them. So, grab the person on her way to Kroger's, not on her way from. And the police finally stepped up a little bit, but this culminated with a man in the Kroger's parking lot essentially being extorted. And then the person followed him home just around the corner, demanded more money and struck him so forcefully he was knocked over, smashed his head, and died. And so the whole community was really upset, needless to say, that this was, just there were so many of these assaults in a very small area. And so we started what we called BASTA. BASTA means like enough already, and had some BASTA events in a little square right near where all this was happening. But all along, we saw BASTA as not just violence against immigrants, but what have we had enough of? Well, we've had enough of men drunk driving and being deported. 80% of those 200 beds in Butler County are filled by guys who were picked up drunk driving and are being deported, which is can totally screw their families. And then domestic violence. So we're sort of going at it from a much more comprehensive picture to kind of ease our way into it. And we did some wheat pasting with Basta signs, as well as some, some big banners and masks that say Basta. So kind of getting the idea out there. And now we're going to start to move more on this, but rolling it into enough, our community does not deserve this. And this, so instead of singling this out to try and say, this is part of a much bigger picture of problems in this community. That's all I can say.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Nancy. That really speaks to, and I think we keep hearing this over and over again during our discussion tonight, that these issues are so very intricate, and not just intricate in and of themselves, but intricately connected to one another. We see that homelessness is connected very much to domestic violence and so on. Issues of immigration also connected with abuse and homelessness, poverty being the thread that ties them all together. And so for my final question to the panelists, knowing that these things are connected and knowing all of the great ways that our agencies have responded, what else do we need? What do we need from our community members? What do we need from the participants, the folks who are here with us this evening listening to this discussion? What are those calls to action? Knowing that the pandemic isn't going away anytime soon, and these issues of violence and poverty and homelessness have been around a long time. How can we pull together as a community to care for one another? How can we pull together as a community to prevent these acts of harm from happening in the first place? How can we really show love and support to one another, even in the darkest and coldest of times? So with that, I want to start with Bonita. Bonita, what are your calls to action? What do you want folks to know and to do?
So I hardly ever go anywhere and talk to people and not say, if you know somebody, or if you are a landlord, live next to a landlord, rent yourself, think about young people. And I say that knowing that there's a housing crisis, but also, and of course, housing discrimination is illegal, but trust me, people find a way not to rent to young people, 18 to 24-year-olds. Again, they're young people learning how to live on their own. We are by their sides. They're gonna be the ones who take care of us, who are want to learn to be contributing members of our society. And they deserve that. And again, these are young people that may not have chosen to go to college for any number of reasons. And so the second part of my ask and my call to action is to think about everybody doesn't go to college. We are losing those skilled laborers, if you will, those vocations that are critical, the carpenters, the plumbers, all of those people, the handymans, and they are there. Our young people need mentors, need people by their side that are going to help them and just show them how to be productive employees. And we need to build a network of employers that are going to give these young people a chance, that recognize that may not be that traditional employee, that they're going to take a little bit more time. They're going to take a little bit more hand holding along the way. because there are some real traumas. I think the other thing that we all should prepare ourselves for, and I've talked about it a lot on a homeless call that we have weekly, that has helped us get through this pandemic together as a homeless community. We are starting to see an increase in mental health symptomology within the shelters. And I think it's a function of everything that has been going on, in terms of the evictions, the lack of employment, the other barriers that people are experiencing. But even for those people that haven't experienced it to the level that our clientele has right now, again, this isn't over yet. And so as this continues, I think we need to start preparing for what is next and how do we address the trauma that people have experienced and that is yet to come. Because even as we stabilize the people that we are looking at right now, we still have that residual effect of what they've gone through. And we need to make sure that we are addressing those issues and helping them realize the trauma that they've been through, because it has been real for them and their families. And it's not just I lost my job or I lost my housing, but everything else that this has brought up for them and their communities and their networks. And so we need to start looking at that now.
I'd also like to add, Bonita, when we think about those pathways to youth homelessness, especially in those situations of child abuse, or those situations specifically for our queer young folks, who are kicked out of their homes because their identity and who they are is unacceptable in the home that they're raised in, or even a combination of both, not being accepted and being abused then by their family members. Um, you know, what we need a lot of, and my call to action really is to just really let people be authentically who they are and celebrate the diversities that we have, in each other, and really work to, take care of those kiddos, and support them in their growth and their development as fully wonderful, human beings.
Absolutely.
Bonita, are there any other calls to action? Are there any legislation items up for vote right now, or pieces that are in the works? Or are there any other ways that folks can get involved with Lighthouse, to help you all in the work that you do?
So there was a legislation, and I'm sorry that I don't know where it's at right now. There was a number of us that wrote in to HUD, because there was legislation that did not want to allow LGBTQ youth and transgender in particular into shelters. And so we actually wrote letters to say that that was not appropriate and that they deserve to be allowed into shelters and safe in shelters as much as anybody else. And so we're still waiting to see what that legislation is going to look like. I think with the new administration, we will probably have a better chance at that legislation not passing. And so we'll continue to watch that, and see what happens with that. Lighthouse does have our safe and supportive programming. We also offer training with PREP, which is Personal Responsibility and Education Program, for young people with healthy relationships and social responsibility. We also offer host homes for LGBTQ and queer youth, so that if they have to leave their families or are homeless, there's also some other host homes that they can go to and not end up in the homeless situations. We also offer housing with or training with Faith and Family. So that training is specifically for young children who, and working with their families to help them accept their queer child, really around when those families are saying it's against my religion, but to help them understand what their young person is going through and help them bridge that gap to accept their young person authentically for who they are. So we offer a variety of different trainings for organizations, support for families as well. And so we will come to your organization and do that training, or you can attend trainings virtually through Lighthouse. Well, it's all virtual, but we'll do it specifically for your agency or through Lighthouse's virtual trainings. So lots of resources out there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bonita. Mona, let me shoot it your way. What are your calls to action? What do we need folks to do?
So one of the things that I would like to emphasize is I think in order for us to move forward, we kind of got to take a step back. And part of that is realizing how we got
Sorry, Mona, we have a technical difficulty. You appear to be frozen.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, but your video's kind of frozen a little bit.
Yep.
Okay, I think you're good.
Okay. I'm going to repeat. Basically, we need to take a step back to move forward, realize that homelessness is a systemic issue. We just did not get here overnight. So we want community members to learn about how racism, economic segregation, redlining, restrictive covenants, policies that were established by the federal, state, and local government contributed, real estate agents, segregation, how currently these policies and development choices and decisions are affecting the housing stock. And let's talk about the elephant in the room. More recently, some of the folks that we elected into office, council members who decided to take bribes, allegedly, because no one's been convicted, one person has, to developers to receive payoffs to allow for particular development that were not inclusive take place, and they receive tax abatements. They receive public goods. And this literally has killed folks. If we look at the FC Cincinnati event, you know, we talked about how Miss Page, Miss Mary, 99-year-old woman had to move. We didn't talk about how she died just a few months later. We didn't talk about how Mr. Ken Rhodes died just a few months later because of the trauma that they endured from going through that situation. And that's very common. So understanding that this is life or death for people, and holding these folks accountable. What's happened with these developers? They played this, you know, pay to play game. Why have they not been brought to light? Why are they still getting tax abatements? Why have we not said, you know what, you should not get this tax abatement anymore? Let's put this towards affordable housing. One of the things that we have going right now is the Affordable Housing Now campaign. So we got a trust fund, and we are trying to set an established stream of income for that. And so in May on the ballot, we are trying to get that legislation up. It's a charter amendment. So we want folks to sign the ballot initiative that we have. We want folks to participate in our education programs. We want folks to demand that our government officials make this a priority and be intentional about it. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that, Mona. I'd like to shoot it to Amy now. Amy, what are your calls to action?
Mine are probably very similar to everybody else's, but honestly, it's some pretty basic stuff. One is educate yourself. So all of us are from agencies that provide education and training, and especially during this time, because there's not as many eyes and ears out in the world anymore. You know, we've talked about how children aren't in school, so there's a reduction in people who are seeing children and giving them a safe way to tell somebody something's going on. Um, so really, the more people become trained and educated on these social things that are taking place, and widening that knowledge, you also become able to support people who are experiencing things and maybe don't know how to reach out for help, or noticing signs where, hey, I can at least, tell them, if you need help, there's a couple places that I know of. It doesn't have to be a direct confrontation of, hey, I think you're being abused, or I think you're homeless, or both. um, so it kind of empowers the community at large, which would benefit everybody. um, uh, and then volunteer. I mean, even places like our agency, I'm sure other agencies as well, we rely a lot on volunteers. Um, Even especially with COVID, I've had so many staff who've had to be quarantined, and that reduces how many survivors we reach. So it's really beneficial that we have, that whole text to chat thing we talked about is solely operated by volunteers at this point. um, so once if you have that drive to be involved, to get involved somehow, um, you know donate when you can, you know share Facebook things, be part of social media, especially where everybody is home a lot more often. People are reading a lot more and seeing a lot more information. So I always encourage people, be part of the people who are sharing valid information, and sharing information that could potentially help save somebody else, or help in a situation that maybe you don't know what to do, but here's the information of someplace that at least probably has a little bit more insight. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, and I'm always a proponent of teaching healthy relationship skills. Personal boundary setting. I mean, it may seem like such a little thing, but learning how to set and assert boundaries with folks, having family discussions about those boundary violations and those frustrations, and being able to really work on and practice your healthy communication skills and conflict resolution skills. Trying to work with, in a lot of the work that I do with young people, trying to prepare them for present day and future life situations, by teaching those just basic communication skills, can go a long way, or doing those types of safety planning things. As you might see in the chat box, our folks, our panelists are putting donation information. Obviously, we know that times are hard and finances are slim, but if you are able, or if you have people in your life who are able to contribute even $5, $10 to one or many of our organizations, we would love to have your financial support. You can actually text Havens, the word Havens, to 41444 in order to donate to Women Helping Women Tonight. So we do have that text to donate feature. I think one last person we need to hear from is Nancy. Nancy, really quickly, because we are running out of time and we want to get to participant questions. What are 2 or 3 calls to action that you have?
Oh, actually, I want to throw it back in your lap, because I'm really curious to know more about the green dot idea, and how it appears to me that it's mostly used on college campuses, or God forbid, in Air Force bases where they certainly need it. But how we could adapt it here in Cincinnati, and specifically how I could be bringing in women, particularly from the immigrant community, to initiate it here. So it's among adults, not just your typical group, the middle school and high schoolers. So it's in your lap.
Thanks, Nancy. Um, I'm not a panelist tonight, but I will answer that question. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Green Dot program, it is a bystander intervention training or skill building program. The idea is that every act of violence that we see or hear or bear witness to in our community, whether that's somebody making a stereotypical comment about a certain identity group or a certain person of an identity group, or whether that is an actual act of violence, such as, being discriminatory or aggressive towards somebody, stalking somebody, attacking somebody, abusing someone. All of those are red dots. And a green dot is when people step in or step up to intervene in those situations or do things to prevent those things from happening in the first place. So every time I go to teach a healthy relationships course or a course on consent and personal boundaries, like that would be a proactive green dot, because I'm trying to prevent those things, those boundary violations and consent violations from happening in the first place. One of the great things that Women Helping Women does is the BAR training program, which teaches people in the service industry, especially at alcohol serving establishments, how to recognize situations of sexual aggression or relationship aggression and how to intervene in order to stop that act of violence and make sure that the person who is being harmed or targeted for that violence is safe and protected. So the Green Dot program works in our school communities, in community groups. It is most often done in high schools and colleges, but I am a Green Dot certified trainer for community groups. And so I often get requests for trainings in our community here to do those kinds of workshops. So really, training people many different ways on how to intervene when you see those situations of violence. So with that, we only have a few minutes left for our event tonight. So I just want to thank you all for showing up, for being present, for paying attention. As you will notice in the chat box, Maria has let us all know that there is a survey that we would love for you all to take. Give us your feedback. This is our second in a series of community conversations. And we're always trying to do things better and learn the technology better. So don't forget to take that survey. We will send that out to everyone after the event is over. This event is also live recorded and will be posted online for future reference, or if you want to share it, if you thought the information here was really valuable and you would like to share that with your friends, your family members, or other partner agencies, that would be fantastic. So with that, I want to open it up to any questions from our audience. What spoke to you? What resources do you need? Feel free to put those questions in the chat box, or even unmute yourself. But it is 8:25 and the event ends at 8:30.
I have a question.
Hi.
Hello. So my question is, this relates to the immigrants. So I live here in California, Oakland, Bay Area. So I'm curious. So here in the Bay Area, they educate the immigrants to know that they have rights. And I'm inquiring, do the people that are there in the state of Ohio, do they also know their legal rights of what to do in case they are approached by an ICE agent?
Oh, I can answer that. That's a great question. We certainly have done a lot of Know Your Rights training in person, in churches, in unions, in various print methods. There's some great videos for people who don't read. I have to say that this is a very different community, unlike Oakland, where there's been a very large immigrant community, or could be second, third generation, that's much more acculturated. And so knowing those things, that information is just, people are much more aware of it. Not that we don't try and do that all the time here. I mean, it's incredible how often people are astounded that the police here do not work with ICE. It's actually in the CPD handbook. And so one reason that they're afraid to call the police is that they think they'll be immediately detained. So it's not even knowing your rights for ICE, it's knowing that you're not going to run into trouble just trying to be safe.
I can understand that because I was watching a program on Netflix. It's called Immigration Nation, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
And they spoke about some sheriff programs that were involved in, I think it was called 408, 308 something program. And that's done voluntarily by the police department. So they don't have to do
Well,
it.
the only place that we have that in all of Ohio is Butler County. Surprise, surprise, for people who are here. And that is a very different thing. But when all these people were being assaulted in this neighborhood and we had these meetings, I had people come forward and say, well, I was also assaulted, but I was afraid to call the police. And then I end up accompanying them to make a police report. So you're absolutely right. It is a very different community here than Oakland.
Thank you so much for your question. I think, knowing your rights trainings are really, really critical. One of the things that we try to teach in our prevention programs at Women Helping Women, especially for our younger students, is Title IX rights for students around intimate partner violence, dating violence, and sexual assault, or even sexual harassment in their schools. And that anti-discrimination and anti-sexual harassment rights in the workplace as well. It is 8:29. We only have about a minute left. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to more questions, but I do want to thank you all for your time this evening. What a wonderful Tuesday. I hope that you all have your gears are turning and that you have some great ideas on how to get involved and how to work towards ending the issues of homelessness and domestic violence and the connections between those things. So with that, I want to say good night, farewell, mask up, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.